Hello, this is Jason Hartsfield, Career Academy Associate with Starkloff Disability Institute. Today's topic is going to be about disability disclosure. We'll answer some common questions about when and how to disclose and cover what the law says about disclosure, but we'll start by asking a simple question: why should I disclose? The answer to this question is complex, but we want to start by emphasizing that disclosure is a personal choice. You do not have to disclose your disability at any time, whether job searching or after you find a job. But as we'll argue, disclosing might actually prove beneficial. So why should you disclose your disability? To begin, if you need assistive technology, adjustments in your work schedule, leave for doctor's visits, or just simply an understanding from your supervisor, you'll need to request reasonable accommodations due to a disability. While you don't have to go into any detail, your employer can request verification of disability from a doctor. Another reason to be forthright with your disability is that it simply makes it easier for others to understand your behavior. There is a primitive part of our brain that is hypersensitive to anything that seems not quite right, and a lot of unconscious behaviors that we have as people with disabilities fall into this category. I for one know that my nystagmus is weird. I've had bosses tell me so. Sensory disabilities, mental health disabilities, muscular disabilities, chronic health conditions, and so on all lead to small behavioral adjustments that are going to be noticed. Disclosure is one of the best ways to deal with the anxiety that will arise in people's minds because of those behaviors. Once they know what's going on, it's not a big deal. The third reason to disclose is a more altruistic one. By being open about your disability, you increase the visibility of all people with disabilities in the workplace. Part of the reason why barriers to people with disabilities still exist is because the able-bodied are generally uninformed about what we can actually do. When they see a person with a disability working an everyday job like everyone else, they become more accepting to all people with disabilities. Finally, disclosing during the application process can actually lead to smoother interviewing. This is something many people are surprised to learn, so let's explore further. To understand why disclosure during the application process can be helpful, you need to understand that the recruiter's job is half talent acquisition, half risk management. Hiring a new employee is a long-term investment. It will cost the company thousands of dollars to train and equip you. So if the recruiter feels you might cost the company more money than you're worth, you won't get the job. In order to make the right decision, recruiters need to get as much information about you as possible. That is the real purpose of the job interview. It's already been decided that you meet the minimum qualifications for the job. The recruiter uses the job interview to gather additional information so they can choose the most talented and least risky of all potential candidates. The less information the recruiter has, the more likely they are to pass you up. This is bad for people with disabilities because most likely the recruiter doesn't know anything about how your specific disability will impact your job. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, recruiters are only legally allowed to ask if you can do the job with or without accommodations. They can ask you to demonstrate how you will do a job, but they cannot ask you anything directly related to your disability. For an untrained recruiter, this can be a major challenge. They'll have questions about your disability, but they can't ask them. If you don't address their concerns, they'll likely assume you're more of a risk than you actually are. This becomes particularly tricky for people with not so obvious disabilities. Remember my story from earlier? Your subconscious adaptations to your disability could result in behavior that raise questions or can be distracting. But the ADA doesn't just restrict what the recruiter can ask during an interview. It also requires companies make sure you have whatever accommodations you need for a successful interview. Recruiters are constantly on guard for violations, so even if you don't need an accommodation for the interview, they may sense one brewing if you show up without letting them know what to expect first. To sum up, the recruiter is a human being prone to the same tendency to panic in new situations as anyone else. They've worked hard to get where they are, and they want to do a good job. If you disclose in the right way at the right time, you'll make their jobs a lot easier, and you'll have demonstrated an impressive amount of integrity. What is the right way to disclose? Because disability is a protected status, disclosing too quickly can make it seem like you expect to get the job only because you're disabled. That is why you never start the conversation with a full disclosure. Wait until you've had a chance to sell yourself first. Make sure you've made a good first impression, and don't make your disability your reason for applying or primary selling point. If you're contracted to schedule a face-to-face interview, wait until the end of the conversation to inform the recruiter about your disability and briefly let them know what to expect when you arrive. Whenever you're disclosing, keep it brief and focused on the job. Going too heavily into your diagnosis or metabolic processes is distracting and irrelevant. Your discussion should only be focused on what you need the employer to know so you can get the job and stay productive. Another reason not to go into detail is because some disabilities are still very stigmatized. For example, if you have to see a psychiatrist once a month for a mental health disability, the only thing you need to tell your supervisor is that you need an adjustable work schedule because you see a doctor for an ongoing health issue. As mentioned, employers are allowed to require a doctor's note, but the note doesn't need to be anything other than a confirmation of disability. The doctor is not required to provide, nor can the employer demand, your diagnosis or any of your medical history before you can request an accommodation. Finally, whenever disclosing your disability, focus on your strengths. What are the unique skills and talents you've developed living with your disability? This can be tough. People aren't used to seeing disability as an asset. That's why we created an exercise we call the Disability Success Story, which we will walk you through now. Before we begin, we need to first identify what we mean by disability. According to the World Health Organization, disability is an umbrella term encompassing a medical impairment, the resulting activity limitations, and the impact society structures has on those limitations. For example, I have ocular albinism. Medically, my eyes were supposed to work a certain way, but because some parts didn't develop properly, they don't. This is a medical impairment. Because my eyes don't work as they should, I am limited in certain activities. Most importantly, I can't drive. While not being able to drive is inconvenient, it only becomes a participation restriction when we remember that our society is built on the assumption that everyone can drive. Since I can't, my freedom of movement is restricted. Not being able to work is a participation restriction. Our society assumes that people with disabilities aren't productive. We confront this myth by using our disability success stories. First, identify your medical impairment. Write out your diagnosis and explain in a sentence or two what parts of your body, specifically, don't work like they're supposed to. Second, list 5 or more activity limitations you deal with on a daily basis. These can be anything, but the more they are related to job skills, the better. Third, for each activity limitation you listed, list 1 or more adaptations you've made. This includes any assistive technology you use, as well as any adjustments to your environment you've made. Examples include using a wheelchair or eating a healthy diet so as to avoid a disease flare-up. Fourth, for each adaptation you make, write out 1 or more unique talents, skills, or experiences that you've gained. For example, hiring your own personal care attendant requires management skills. Taking public transportation requires organization, time management, and of course a lot of patience. Finally, put together a sentence for each of your activity limitations, explaining what your limitation is, what adaptations you make, and a strength that comes from using that adaptation. If we use my example, my sentence reads, "Because of my medical impairment, I can't drive a car, so I use public transportation, which means I am very well organized and have good time management skills." Thus, we've turned my participation restriction into an asset. Let's look at another disability success story. Tiffany is a graduate of our spring 2017 class and has cerebral palsy, which is a disability of the central nervous system. Because Tiffany's brain doesn't communicate with the rest of her body as it should, she has limitations related to mobility and dexterity. One of her activity limitations is that Tiffany can't type very well. To adapt to this limitation, she uses a voice-activated software called Dragon Naturally Speaking. This software allows her to access a computer like anyone else. Because Dragon sometimes makes mistakes, Tiffany has to have much greater attention to detail and check her work regularly. Since she sometimes has to repeat herself, she is more patient. As a result, she can actually complete her work faster than an able-bodied typist. Tiffany has developed some not-so-obvious skills that more than compensate for her obvious limitations. She'll use her success story during her disclosure to show that she can do the same job as anyone else and that her experience with disability makes her a unique asset to the company. Armed with the knowledge of why and how to disclose, let's end with a brief discussion on when to disclose. Disclosing your disability on a resume or cover letter is extremely job-specific. In general, your resume and cover letter are about work-related skills. This isn't the time to discuss your disability, unless your disability has provided you with a unique skill set that would be applicable to the job. If, for example, you're applying for a home health care agency, knowledge about hiring and managing your own personal care attendant might be worth discussing in a cover letter. But again, the primary focus is on your job skills rather than your disability. We get asked a lot about disclosure on the job application. Specifically, we're asked about whether or not to fill out the self-identification form for people with disabilities. The answer is yes, you want to disclose on this form. The only companies allowed to use this form are federal contractors, and under the 2014 changes to Section 503 of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, these companies are expected to pursue a goal of people with disabilities representing 7% of their workforce at all job levels. This means that disclosing to a federal contractor might make you more eligible and at the very least doesn't hurt you. As discussed, if you have a visible disability, it's generally a good idea to disclose before you meet your recruiter face-to-face. Likewise, if you have a not-so-obvious disability, that might raise some eyebrows. Occasionally, we get people who say they are afraid to ask for accommodations for the interview because they're scared they'll be turned down. Don't be. Under the law, employers have to give you any reasonable accommodations you need, and as we said earlier, employers are eager to comply with the law. You might consider a brief disclosure as part of the conversation when networking. People you meet will have questions but probably won't ask out of fear of offending you. Let them know you're willing to answer questions they may have, but don't be afraid to assert your boundaries. Politely focus the conversation back onto your job skills. If you need accommodations to have a successful networking experience, don't hesitate to ask. You'll be demonstrating your assertiveness and making a positive first impression. But what do you do if you don't have a visible disability? You'll need to ask yourself if you require accommodations for the job. If so, the interview is a good time to bring this up, but do so after you've established a good rapport with the interviewer. Wait until later in the interview when you'll be given a chance to ask your own questions. Alternatively, as stated, the law allows recruiters to ask if you can perform the duties of the job with or without accommodations. This presents another opportunity to talk about any accommodations you might need. In conclusion, deciding when and how to disclose depends on a lot of different factors. Will you actually need accommodations? Do you have an obvious disability or a not-so-obvious quirk of behavior that would be distracting? Legally, you don't have to disclose at all unless you need an accommodation, but doing so might make things easier for you and your recruiter. When you do decide to disclose, make sure your disclosure is brief. Only give them the information they need and keep it focused on your job duties. Use your disability success story to turn your disclosure into a discussion of your unique assets as a person with a disability. This concludes today's presentation on disability disclosure. Individual disclosure strategy planning is one of the many services we offer to members of our Career Academy. If you would like to learn more about this and other services, contact us at info@starkloff.org. That's info@starkloff.org. You can also call us at 314-588-7090. Thank you and good luck.